And welcome everybody. Thank you for taking some time from your schedule, your life, to be with us today for an hour. We're going to have a discussion today on women in leadership positions and their efforts on rooting out corruption. So my name is Mikra Krasniqi. I am a program director here with the Center for International Private Enterprise Policy and Program Learning. For those of you unfamiliar with the organization, CIPE was founded in 1983 and has been working with partners around the world in support of democracy and a rules-based private sector, recognizing the intertwined nature as fundamental to long-term stability. We offer leadership and expertise in areas like anti-corruption, entrepreneurship training, supporting independent businesses and think tanks, and we try to reinforce these foundations and create an enabling environment for business and democracy to flourish. CIPE is one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy and an affiliate of U.S. Chambers of Commerce. This discussion today is part of the policy series Solutions, which is part of the policy and program learning here at CIPE. We organize and share some of our research findings and try to identify gaps in policy processes and apply some of the learning tools and interventions. So in that vein, it's my pleasure to introduce our guests who have worked and done research on today's topic that explores various aspects of women empowerment, both in public and private sector leadership sphere, and how their voice and fight against the corruption matter. Excuse me. So let me start first with our in-house leader in that front. Barbara Langley serves as director for CIPE's Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. In this capacity, she leads CIPE's strategy to amplify the voice of the private sector through women's equal participation in free markets and democratic institutions. Before CIPE, Langley served for nearly 20 years at the International Republican Institute, holding temporary and long-term postings in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Jordan, Mongolia, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia, and Washington, D.C. She also held senior management positions as executive director for IRI's Arab Women's Leadership Program, deputy director for the Institute's Middle East and North Africa Division, and deputy director for IRI's Women and Democracy Network. Langley also served in George W. Bush administration as confidential assistant in the office of the director of the U.S. Peace Corps. She received a bachelor's degree of arts in Russian and international studies in 1996 from Millersville University of Pennsylvania and completed the American University's Campaign Management School in May 2000. Welcome, Barb.
Thanks, Mikra.
Our next guest is Dr. József Péter Martin, who is an executive director of Transparency International in Hungary since 2013. He's also a senior lecturer at the Department of Public Policy and Management at Corvinus University of Budapest, delivering courses on corruption analysis and institutional economics. In 2019, he was seconded by Transparency International UK as Director of Research. Prior to TI, he worked as a journalist and was editor-in-chief of a Hungarian business weekly, Fügyelő, in English, Observer, between 2003 and 2009, and won the Hungarian Pulitzer Memorial Prize with his team. Between journalism and TI, he worked as a freelance consultant commissioned by domestic and international media. He's author of 24 academic publications and co-authored 1 book. He's an economist and sociologist by trainee, holding a PhD degree. He's native Hungarian and speaks English, French, and some Russian. Welcome, József.
Thank you very much, Mikra.
So let me start with you. So this conversation came about when you wrote that paper for PPL, CIPE's Policy and Program Learning, and in your research, you highlight that women in leadership roles can contribute to reducing corruption. Before we talk specifically about Hungary, can you point us to some of the research showing the notions that a higher proportion of women in business and politics are less susceptible to corrupt behaviors. Talk about some of the key conditions that enable women in decision-making roles to fight corruption. What sets them apart? And why would they differ from their male counterparts in power?
Thank you very much, Mikra, for the introduction as well as for the question. Very happy to be here and share the main insights of this research and paper. So indeed, the research implied that women are less corruptible than men, and therefore a bunch of researchers conclude that as well as in country level and as well as in the organization owner level or company level, the female participation is associated with lower level of corruption. The question is, why is it? I would differentiate between two sets of factors based on the research. One I would call individual factors. The second I would call the institutional factors. So let's talk about first about the individual factors. The researchers show that men are much more self-centered or individually oriented than women. Also, research show that women are more likely to take stronger position on moral and social issues than men. Also, women perform better on integrity tests and behave more generously when faced with financial decisions. So, to sum it up, the individual factors, we could say that women will be less likely to forgo the common good in favor of their own economic interests than men. So that's about, in a nutshell, about the individual factors. About the institutional factors, here I would differentiate three, I would say, sub-lines of this scholarship. One is, and the most important is that according to the literature, women are dependent on the welfare state, much more dependent than men. And this dependence is called the double dependence after Monica Bauer, scholar who deals with gender empowerment issues. So according to her and also lots of her followers, it is in women's interest to keep the welfare state and maintain its integrity and to fight against corruption, because corruption of course undermines the welfare state. So why is it so? It is so because the welfare state promotes first employment opportunities for women by breaking the collusive networks of men, and secondly because it provides services for maternity leave and elder care. So that's why the conclusion is this double dependence on the welfare state. So this is I would call the first institutional factor, and probably the most important one. But this most important one, especially in the liberal democracies, because according to some other researches, the more women, less corruption equation is certainly true in the liberal democracy, but not necessarily true in a hybrid regime or in autocracies or in a dictatorship. So, because if corruption becomes a norm and not just a bug, then or a dysfunction of the system, then this equation might not work. Then being corrupt sometimes may be maybe less risky than being non-corrupt. So that's why these institutional factors, the underlying nature of the political regime, it plays a very, very important role. And well, when we will talk about Hungary, my home country, that it will be the case that unfortunately the very fact that women are in some positions, it will not guarantee more inclusiveness, less opportunism, less corruption, more transparency, because of the nature of the regime. So the democratic institution activate the relationship between gender and corruption. If there is no democratic, there are no democratic institutions in a country, or they do not work properly, only, let's say, nominally, like this is the case in Hungary, then the empowerment of women might be undermined and might not have the due effect. And last but not least, I would mention the importance of the informal institutions, or social norms, in other words. It is also happening, and mostly in non-democracies or fragile democracies or autocracies. It is also happening that there are some progressive legislation, but this progressive legislation is undermined not only by the not properly working institutions, but also by the traditional values of the society. So that might be also the case. There is also plenty of literature about it. Thank you.
That's great, fascinating. I mean, later on we will drill a little bit more into those nuanced findings that you're talking about. But for now, I wanted to turn to Barbara. And in your long work in this area, you've seen it all, Barb, and you've worked in several aspects, as I said. But right now at CIPE, at CIPE, it works in three primary areas of women empowerment. One of them is personal empowerment, another one is community building, and another one is institutional reform. So can you share with us a bit more of how these areas work, and give us an example perhaps of the center's work for each, and how they interact together perhaps to elevate women to leadership positions?
Yeah, thank you, Mikra. Happy to address that. Before I do, I just wanted to, again, thank you for the invitation to join you today and to speak a little bit about some of these issues that I'm so passionate about. And I just wanted to say hello to our colleagues and friends and partners across the globe. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to you all. Really excited about this discussion, and I confess that József's already given us such a big chunk to chew on a little bit. And József, I confess that I got a little bit of a pit in my stomach when you were talking about how women have a bit of a reliance on the welfare state. I don't doubt it. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but just coming from my own personal background that focuses on individual responsibility and sort of being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about CIPE's approach to women's economic empowerment, because I think that it offers some choices beyond that reliance on government. I mean, certainly government has its place, but I think that there are some other things that we can do when we're organized well as a constituency group. So let me talk a little bit about CIPE's approach to women's economic empowerment, and hopefully through our conversation, we can marry the two together. We've really witnessed a remarkable impact by pursuing a holistic, inclusive approach to women's economic empowerment, improving economic ecosystems, as Mikra had said, through 3 levels of entrepreneurial or business communities. That first level of activities really focuses on the individual. It fosters an entrepreneurial mindset. It focuses on leadership development and empowerment. And then as we move to the second level of activities, we're working with those individuals and trying to help build relationships by linking community actors and creating collaborative spaces in which to work. As that continues to grow and come full circle, the third level of activities that we work on seeks to improve the environment for women in business by promoting entrepreneur-friendly policies, lowering barriers, and garnering community and official support. So just to give you some examples of what it is that CIPE does, at that first level, focused on the individual, we have found great results in establishing women's business resource centers. These WBRCs, which we call them by their acronym, are safe spaces with childcare, where women of various backgrounds can access educational opportunities and essential resources, receive mentoring and training from established entrepreneurs to start up, but even more importantly, to scale up their businesses and employ more people in their community. The WBRC addresses some of the main barriers to women's economic empowerment and participation, including access to capital, access to technology, lack of business skills, among others. For example, CIPE has supported training and mentoring efforts as well as resource development on such issues as women's leadership, women in the technology sector, corporate governance, and private sector response even to online and offline gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. Moreover, these WBRCs foster a collaborative approach with both the international and domestic non-governmental organization community and help to deliver resources outside of CIPE's expertise, such as support for women's health and connections to resources on gender-based violence and harassment. We've launched WBRCs in Papua New Guinea, Guatemala, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, and Ethiopia, and we're working to launch new centers in the countries of Africa's Sahel region. As women entrepreneurs and business owners grow in their roles, we're continuing to support in the second level of the ecosystem by promoting the establishment of informal and formal networks that build the capacity and leadership of women in the country to drive changes that lead to economic empowerment. We often work through and typically work through women's chambers of commerce and business associations, or the women's wings of mainstream chambers and business associations to provide those training, skills development, and mentorship opportunities. In addition, we work with local partners to provide technical assistance and small grant support for projects that promote women's economic empowerment in the local market. These network opportunities allow women to exchange information and best practices, establish mentorship links between organizations, develop new business and export opportunities, and build relationships among women business owners and community leaders, starting to create that sort of stakeholder group, that power network that we often hear about. The program model also helps to build strong and resilient women's business support organizations that represent the voice of women in the private sector and ensure their needs are met in legislative and regulatory reform and even advancements in social norms, or to implement strong laws that are already on the books, strong regulations that are already on the books. So while we're supporting a number of local and country level networks, we're also supporting cross-regional networking in all regions of the globe through partnership with the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the US State Department through a project called We Champs. And then finally, as the journey through the enabling environment comes full circle at the third level, CIPE actively pursues policy priorities and issues advocacy efforts as led by local partners and technically advised by CIPE. We have a very successful women's business agenda model, which is an advocacy tool adapted from the experience of the US Chamber of Commerce and successfully employed in countries from Moldova to Bangladesh and Nigeria to the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Each of these demonstrates solid impact in driving reforms, changing legislation, and again, even ensuring that good laws on the books are actually implemented. And the results are really remarkable. For example, in Papua New Guinea, our women's business advocacy network, launched by CIPE, got a piece of legislation that would incentivize retiring civil servants to launch entrepreneurial endeavors in agribusiness. And they got it to move after 10 years of sitting on someone's desk. In Nigeria, CIPE's partner, the Association for Nigerian Business Women's Network, succeeded to increase the percentage of appointed government positions for women. And in Bangladesh, the Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry succeeded in advocating for gender-sensitive loan desks in commercial banks. This helped to unlock $95 million for more than 10,000 women business owners and allowed them to scale up their businesses and employ more citizens in their communities. And in more recent examples, in Kazakhstan, for example, CIPE supported an advocacy group the advocacy group succeeded in getting a law on social entrepreneurship passed through government channels, opening up new opportunities for women in the private sector to succeed. Mikra, I honestly could go on and on with all the examples that CIPE has, but I'll pause here because I know that we're short on time.
I know. Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. I know there's so much you can talk about these things forever. Let me turn to József. To you now. Earlier, you just sort of like gave us an overview about this institutional versus individual factors as to why it makes women leaders a little bit less susceptible to corruption in public. And you also drew some differences between democracies and authoritarian or autocratic regimes and how corruption plays there. Now, let me sort of like zoom into Hungary now a little bit and ask you that, we learned in your research, your paper you wrote for us, that women in senior and mid-level management position in the private sector in Hungary, for example, is among the highest in the EU, right? While the proportion of seats held by women in the Hungarian parliament is one of the lowest, if not the lowest. Why is private sector in Hungary more inclusive than politics? And what are the implications of this divide?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mikra. So yes, indeed, I think the most important takeaway of this research is, at least concerning Hungary, that there is a significant divide between the public and private sector in Hungary in this respect. And there are plenty of data which support, and some of them you have already referred to, which support this statement that there is a huge gap between in terms of women empowerment between the public and the private sector. So according to the World Bank Gender Data Portal, Hungary had the lowest proportion of seats. So Hungary is was in the last place according to the newest data held by women in national parliament across the whole EU. Moreover, the Hungarian data, which is 13%, is less than the share of most African countries, including Libya, Sudan, or South Africa, where the share is more than 13%. For example, in South Africa is 47, or in Sudan is 16. So the underrepresentation of women in politics is reflected in some other indicators as well, in a variety of democracy indicators, power distributed by gender, or women political participation index. In the latter, the women political participation index, Hungary was again dead last among the EU countries, lagging behind Cyprus, Romania, and Malta. Statistics show the situation is slightly better in the judiciary, inside the public sector, but that could be presumed that this was because women tended to fill low-paying courts secretary and drafter jobs, from which promotion to higher positions were rare. So this is in a nutshell about the public sector. Now let's speak about the private sector, where the situation is more promising, as you said, although it's not rosy either. So I will tell you why it's more promising and why it's not rosy. So according to World Bank gender data set. In the past 3 years, Hungary was in the 8th place in the EU when the share of firms with female top managers was ranked, and had similar results concerning the middle management. Concerning the entrepreneurship, Hungary was also the 3rd in the EU concerning the share of female ownership. Just in the footnotes, which is not mentioned because it cannot be mentioned in the statistics, that according to some observers and according to some of my interviewees, it might be because in the current regime, some of the oligarchs put to the name of their wives some of the businesses, so that can have a distorting effect. But as the statistics,
but that does not explain, though, right? Why private sector is doing much better than politics. Anyway, I'll let you go on.
That does not explain what explaining is what I said about the top female positions in the companies, where Hungary ranks at the 8th place, number 8 in the EU, female top managers, and even slightly more, I think 6th place when it comes to the middle management positions. And in terms of entrepreneurship, of course, this distortion it's not for the whole spectrum. This is just this might be distortion. But your question was right, because my interviewees were much less enthusiastic about the situation, even in private sector, in this respect, compared to what the statistics show. Because they, especially those who run businesses, so who are entrepreneurs or company leaders, they said, CEOs, they said that they highlighted the following factors. The household works and childcare are not shared equally still, they said. They also highlighted a big divide between the multinational companies and the other companies. The multinational companies, in the multinational companies, the situation is much better because the parent companies push them to comply with the international trends of diversity and inclusiveness. They highlighted, for example, that among the top 200 companies, so among the crème de la crème in the top of the companies, there are still very few women leaders. And they also highlighted that the Hungarian government might not consider a female business leader an equal dialogue partner, which can prevent some multinational companies to appoint female CEOs. So, and also they stress that in the Forbes rich list, which is the top 50 richest, which includes the top 50 richest people, there is only one woman, and there is a separate list in Forbes which is about the influential, about the influence, and the female business leader told me that well, it's unjust that there is a list for most influential women, but the rich list consists also of men. And they were referring to the gender pay gap as well, which was 17.5% back in 2022, compared to the EU average, which is less, only 13%. So the situation is by far not rosy, although we can say that in the private sector, the situation is much better still than in the public sector. Why is it? I would say that this is due to two factors. One is this hybrid electoral autocracy. This is the official name after the European Parliament, which has been evolved in Hungary. We can call it autocracy or hybrid regime. So a kind of unfortunately a sort of authoritarian regime where traditional patriarchic male-centered approach is the most widespread approach. And secondly, because the attitude of the Hungarian population is largely social conservative, and that's why this kind of populist policy they fall into fertile ground. This kind of social conservative attitudes, according to the latest survey, this is not only characteristic to the voter base of the governing party, but unfortunately, partly it's characteristic also to the other layers of the population, including women. So 64% of women they share or they have the approach of traditional male centered nature. Also 52% of the oppositional voters and 55% of people with higher education and 61% of Budapest, so the capital population, preferred the traditional family model. So this shows that the male-centered model extends beyond the pro-government voters and supporters of the regime. And in this respect, my interview is also nuanced a little bit the picture, but in this time into the positive sense, because they said that there is a clear generational gap, and the younger generations are much more eager to speak up when they feel obstructed. So I mean, those young women who feel obstructed, and equality for them has become a basic condition.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And when it comes to voice and speaking up, we'll touch a little bit later on the sort of like cultural and social template that when it comes to power, we're still stuck in a sort of like male-centered world. But for now, Barb, I wanted to ask you, I know CIPE has been part of this international consortium, more specifically partnering with organizations like American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative in a project called the Women and Girls Empowered, or WAGE, funded by the US Department of State. What learning do we have from that project that can demonstrate this credibility of private sector leadership on both business and social issues? If you want to just talk about it briefly.
Yeah, happy to do so, Mikra. And I think, you know, there's a correlation of sorts when it comes to the issue of power, credibility, and really sort of solidifying women's leadership in various stakeholder communities. We have a lot of talent here at CIPE within our Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, for example. Some of the women there have been working on various issues like sextortion and what have you. My team, more specifically under WAGE, was looking at another issue that is also sort of ingrained in this sort of like culture, right? And it focused on gender-based violence and harassment. But we had a number of successes working on this project together with our partners, the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative and Search for Common Ground. And I think that some of the learning from that actually could be it could be brought to the table when we're talking about gender and corruption. And ultimately, yes, we can work with government and we can legislate to fix a problem, but there's a lot more that can be done. And I feel like we get better solutions and sustainable solutions when we're really working with grassroots networks and constituency groups from the ground up to lead on issues like corruption and like gender-based violence and harassment. So just telling you a little bit about that project, ultimately it focused on CIPE's methodology for the women's business agendas, which is something that we typically used with our private sector partners around the globe that typically work just on business-related issues. And often you would find that the issues that were raised and the solutions that were put forward were something that would benefit both men and women. But because women are further disadvantaged, issues like registration fees or administrative fees or having to go to 10 different government agencies to resolve administrative issue for your business impact women more so than men in many regards, right? And so through this learning, we decided to take the methodology and see if we couldn't tackle some social issues that also impact women in the private sector, such as gender-based violence and harassment. I confess in the beginning it wasn't easy. When we talked to our private sector partners about GBV, their sort of gut instinct was that this is not their area of expertise, it's not their area of focus, and that there were women civil society organizations that held the expertise and the sole responsibility for moving this issue. But we encouraged them to talk to their members, talk to women business owners about GBV. And as soon as they did, we found across the globe that the floodgates opened. And it became clear that there is, in fact, a role for women in the private sector to play. And so again, using that methodology from the Women's Business Agenda, but including a broader coalition to include women in civil society, CIPE partners started to tackle this issue with impressive success. The women in private sector helped to lend a credibility. It helped to build a bigger stakeholder group that needed to be listened to, constituency group. And so, for example, in Uzbekistan, CIPE's private sector-led coalition helped to get a law passed criminalizing gender-based violence and harassment where it hadn't been before. And we now have partners in Asia that are both working to raise awareness of gender-based violence and harassment, particularly among women business owners, but then also to work on solutions and creating codes of conduct and corporate policies to better govern business and ensure that the culture of GBV is prevented before it can begin. So I'll pause there, but I'm eager for some discussion on some of these points as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, József, let me be a little bit more specific in directing my next question. And I'll tell you what I mean in a second. How effective are women in leadership roles at disrupting existing networks of patronage or clientelism? What makes them successful or unsuccessful in these efforts? I mean, here I'm thinking of Maya Sandu, President of Moldova, and her campaign to root out corruption. Moldova, under her leadership since 2019, we see that it improved 10 positions in the TI index between 2019 and 2023. Anyway, this is just an example. Perhaps you can elaborate more and bring in more examples. You're muted, I think.
Sorry. Yes, definitely there are some very good international examples. Unfortunately, not from Hungary, but from some other countries. You mentioned Maya Sandu, who is president of Moldova, and who was for a short time also prime minister of Moldova, and who can be perceived also a kind of role model for integrity and definitely a game changer in the anti-corruption fight in her country. But I would like to mention also Laura Kondruta-Kövesi, definitely also somebody who was a game changer in her home country in Romania, and hopefully will be a game changer as the chief public prosecutor in the European Union Prosecution Service. But between 2013 and 2018, Kondruta-Kövesi was president of the Romanian National Anti-Corruption Directorate, and in this capacity they sued lots of white-collar perpetrators of corruption. So this is another very good example. I would say that seen from Hungary, this is absolutely amazing what Ms. Kondruta-Kövesi did in Romania, because suing judges, politicians, former ministers, even former prime minister, it would have been unimaginable, unfortunately, currently in Hungary, but I would say that it would have been unimaginable any time in Hungary in the past 30 years after the change of the regime. And let me mention a third example from another continent, South Africa, where the chief prosecutor Thuli Mandozela, she was nominated by Jacob Zuma, but then her activity turned against the corrupt president, and she published a famous report, State of Capture, back in 2018, and according to the analysis now, this report has contributed to the fall of the Zuma regime and Zuma government. So these are the good examples. I think they are all brave women who could have those skills which are necessary to fight corruption and to go against the political mainstream in their country, which was basically the case in each and every situation. Unfortunately, Hungary, as I said, does not have such example. In the contrary, we have a first ever female president between 2022 and 2024, but that was not a success story. If we have time, I could elaborate on that, but I don't know if we have time for that.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to ask you a related question.
Yes.
Just a quick follow-up, because you say that in Hungary that cannot happen, but as you just elaborated earlier, there are quite successful women leaders in the business sector in Hungary. Now, the question I want to ask is, like, are there ways for these leaders in the private sector to influence public sector corruption efforts? Or are we saying that these domains are too isolated from one another when it comes to fighting corruption?
Yeah, sure. So I will definitely address this question, but just let me share with you just a couple of thoughts. Why not in Hungary, and why in Romania or
right.
in Moldova? Because seen from DC or from elsewhere in the world, it might not be clear why it doesn't happen why did happen in Romania and did not happen in Hungary. And I have two hypotheses for this. One is the type of the regime, and this will be partly the answer to your next question as well. So the more the regime is autocratic, the less is the chance, obviously, for women to be a game changer in the anti-corruption fight. The second, obviously, the personalities. So that matters as well. The personalities, and the third is the traditional, deep-rooted values or approaches of the society. And turning to your question, whether the empowerment of women in the public sector can influence the public sector. Well, my short answer in reflex would be that it cannot, because in an autocratic regime, where this kind of efforts and this kind of best practices which are in place in the private sector, unfortunately, cannot be really translated into the to the public sector. And the example of the Hungarian former president, it underpins this argument as well. So that would be my immediate answer. That these are the two sectors are quite separated. On the other hand,
and is that the case? Would that be the case under both kinds of regimes, like both in a democracy, or are you just talking about here autocratic or hybrid regime?
For sure, I'm talking about the autocratic regime. So in democracy, of course, we know that in democracy, the best practices, they work in an iterative way, both from private to public and from public to private sectors. But in an autocracy, imagine that in an autocracy, and unfortunately, Hungary belongs to an autocracy. So it is not a democracy. We need to underline that all the time. So there is no policy making as such. So there is no bottom-up policy making. Everything which is happening is a top-down approach. So that's why it's an autocracy. So that's why structurally or institutionally, this kind of best practices in the private sector simply cannot get through. However, my interviewee still said some good examples where in some cases they could influence the policy making, totally reframing the issues. So they refer to the work-life balance, family care, or pay transparency issues. And they said that if they use, for example, the word family and not the word gender, then they could reach something at least at the decision makers. But I would say this is rather the exceptions, and this is rather sporadic examples. The general rule is that there is no such breakthrough, there is no such translation from private sector best practices to the public sector in an autocratic regime.
Yeah. Well, this is a great segue into my last question, just before we open up for our listeners and our audience here. You know, one of my favorite authors writing about women in power is a classicist, Mary Beard. She's a classicist, a British classicist, writes a lot about ancient Greece and Roman world. And one of the things that struck me while I was reading this particular book, and I'm just quickly going to quote, so that's going to lead to our next question. She says that the point is simple but important. As far back as we can see in our history, there is a radical separation, real, cultural, and imaginary, between women and power. Now, my question is, what are some of the ways to combat these traditional cultural barriers and institutional norms that inhibit women's inclusion to important position and also have their voice heard? So Barb, I'll start with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Mikra. And it's a fascinating discussion, and I loved listening to your answer to the previous two questions, József. I confess that I had prepared Mikra, and then I decided to toss that all out the window based on some of the things that we've learned at CIPE and some of the experience that we have. I think, you know, József, what he was talking, and József, I hope that I'm capturing this fairly. I think ultimately the answer that you were giving is, the question is, it depends, right? It depends on the regime, the system. It depends on so many different factors. One of the things that we see with CIPE, and to answer your question to me, Mikra, what I would suggest is that there is a real power in grassroots organization. We see it time and again. And when the private sector leads, it brings that sort of economic heft, right? Women are often discounted, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Disempowered.
They're not given due credit. They're not seen as a threat, right? And one of the things that CIPE has seen, even in some of the most autocratic regimes, some of the most closed countries on this earth, is that women are in the private sector, when they are able to come together and organize, that in and of itself is a democratic process. That is the foundation of democracy, that sort of freedom of association. And even in some autocratic regimes, that is still able to happen. And it starts to push open a door and push open a window where expectations are changed among society. I don't mean to be naive and cute about, you know, my thought process with this. We saw recently an example in a country which I won't mention necessarily, just because I don't want to cause any issues for CIPE staff and partners abroad. But we were able to work with a group of women private sector leaders who were able to coalesce. They were able to bring in women from civil society, and they were looking at some issues that focused on intellectual property rights for business owners. And through that, we're able to actually get a law changed in an autocratic country. And so in that to me seems like an area of hope and an area of light that things can change in this world and expectations can start to change. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, József.
Yes, I totally agree, and my interview is confirmed that despite the very disappointing political situation, things in terms of women empowerment have evolved and have developed in many respects in the past years. I would also like to mention the importance of the grassroots organizations and also of the business organizations, business associations. If we consider, for example, that approximately 30-35% of the Hungarian population works for multinational companies, so that's already a big achievement. And in the multinational companies, these values of inclusiveness, diversity, gender equality, and women empowerment, they work not ideally, but much better than in other parts of the Hungarian reality. So I think this is very important. The participation and the affinity and the role of the population here, and the role what they take, it's extremely important. I would like also to highlight the education, which is obviously crucial in this respect, for example, okay, the public education is what it is in an autocratic regime, but still we'll have private education as well. So there these values can be transmitted easier. And last but not least, of course, I would mention the new legislation of the European Union. I would mention here, I probably will not have time to dig into it very deeply, but the pay gap directive and also the quotas. By the way, about the quotas, my interviewees were quite split. So there were some who supported the quotas, and there were some who did not. But nevertheless, there is an advancement in the legislation. Of course, as we know from other areas as well, the most important is that the legislation should go hand in hand with the social norms, because if it is too much detached, then it certainly will not work. But that does not say that legislation is not important. Of course, it is very important. This is the first step. But as Barbara said, I would like to stress the importance of the grassroots organizations and business organizations and as well, and the channel how the values are transmitted from them towards the layers of the population.
That's great. Where did the time go, as they say? Let me just take a couple of questions from the audience, and just to remind the audience that, you know, József's paper, we are publishing it. It should be up on our website this week. We're just putting some final touches to it so that you can see and read in more detail about his findings. Now, here's a question that may spark a different sort of like conversation, but is there a cause? The question is there a cause between corruption and democracy? Because as we can see, some of the most important corruption cases happen in more democratic societies like the European Parliament, for example. So that might be a cause and effect. Anyway, go ahead, please.
If I can add to the question.
Sure.
In my mind, it raises another question is that perception or is it reality? Because in democracies, you're going to have freedom generally of the press,
Reporting.
and have freedom of information, and that type of information is going to come out.
Right.
I would think in autocratic regimes that you are likely getting as much, if not more, but it's not reported.
József?
Yeah, sure. I think I still think that there is a link between corruption and democracy. Although lots of autocratic leaders, they say that corruption exists everywhere, and what happens in liberal democracies is the same. Also, only this is in a hidden form. I don't think that it is true. And basically, I have two basic arguments. I could speak about it a lot, but I have two basic arguments. One is that in autocracies, usually in most of the cases, corruption is institutionalized, and it's endemic, institutionalized, and systemic. So in other words, corruption is not a bug, but a feature, not a dysfunction of the system, but the part of the system. Unfortunately, what is happening in my country is a very striking example of it, how corruption has become and how the capture state has become the enablers of state-driven corruption, when state does not counter corruption, but actively participates in corruption, when corruption has become the method of the governance. So that is one thing. And the second thing, which is obviously not independent from the first one, is that in a democracy, in a proper democracy, in a liberal democracy, when corruption occurs, then there is some consequences of it, both in institutional terms, but also in the societal terms. In an autocracy, when corruption happens, sometimes nothing happens afterwards, because the judiciary is captured and the judiciary doesn't, or the prosecution doesn't make indictments, and also because of the media capture, lots of people simply does not know about this or that corrupt practices, and that's why on the societal level might not happen anything. So that's why at least in these two from these two aspects, I would say that there is a strong difference between democracies and non-democracies when it comes to countering corruption.
Our next question is about what's happening in the news these days about Mexico, and the question comes from Boni Polivka. Mexico has just elected its first female president, but she's been handpicked by the current president, or outgoing president, if you will. The political parties are generally corrupt. How can we identify and promote female anti-corruption politicians where corruption is so systemic? In other words, as more countries become more like Hungary, what hope is there? I'll start with Bart. I'll start with you.
Mikra, you're very kind. I was going to suggest that we start with József, since there was a Hungary reference.
Okay. József?
Well, so there is no quick fix for that. So I think it's quite clear from what we have already said so far. There is in an autocratic environment, obviously there is a limitation of the true women empowerment, and I think it's not it cannot be undermined. So what I would stress is that what we said to the last question, basically. So we shouldn't forget the population. So we shouldn't forget the other stakeholders, like the businesses, civil society. So in this kind of regime, we cannot expect only from the women leaders, if they are elected, to fight against corruption, because if it is an autocratic environment, there will not. What we can do is that we empower the civil society organizations, businesses. We sensitize them to these issues and try to promote that these groups of society put pressure to the government in order to have the right impact towards women empowerment and towards those values that we share.
Thank you, József. Barb, do you want to add something?
Yeah, Mikra, I think I'm just going back to my time over at the International Republican Institute and working with women political activists. And I think I still have faith in grassroots organizing, whether it's political or civic in nature. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we often need to ask women to run. IRI has a campaign that they run from time to time, ask a woman to run. Ensure that she is confident in her skills and her abilities and her stakeholder networks, and really work to promote her throughout. It's not a magic bullet, unfortunately, for our question that for our partner that has asked the question. But ultimately, I just refer back to those grassroots movements. I do still have faith in them, and I think if we can organize together, we're able to put good people forward that can root out some of the corrupt culture in society.
Well, thank you so much for that message. And unfortunately, we're out of time, at least for this discussion, but not out of time in discussing this topic. I want to thank you both first. Barb, thank you so much for all the work you and the team at CIPE you do. And this is great, and we're going to continue this conversation. József, our collaboration with you has brought us to this point, and we look forward to working with you more. And for all the audience out there, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And please try to stay in touch. We're going to have much more, and these conversations are going to continue. So I hope you're joining us in the future. For now, I wish you a good day, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, both.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Everyone. Great talking.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.